The first round of armed resistance to the British by the revolutionaries ended with, of course, the arrest of Baran Ghosh, the exile of Sri Aurobindo, and finally with the arrest of Savarkar. However, this movement, by this time, these ideas had spread very widely, and particularly the idea that Savarkar had put out of trying to infiltrate the British Indian Army. So this movement, which had strong roots by this time in Bengal, in Punjab and in Maharashtra, was brought under one umbrella by a very dynamic and charismatic individual called Behari Bose. And he and his trusted lieutenant Sachindranath Sanyal now decided that they were going to try and take this movement forward. Their first attempt was, of course, to try and kill Lord Hardinge in Chandni Chowk in Delhi, where they nearly succeeded. But really, it was with the coming of the First World War that they began to gather pace. Remember, this was happening at a time that a group of Sikhs based in North America were being organized in what is called the Ghadar movement by, again, a very charismatic individual called Lala Hardayar. And many Sikhs who had made their money or were now began to actually come back to Punjab and began to organize various groups. Now, as this movement began to gather pace, the First World War started, and the British began to recruit very heavily from India, particularly Punjab, but other places as well. And the revolutionaries began to infiltrate them with their ideology. And the idea was that in February 2050, there would be a grand insurrection by the Ghadarites against the British, and that not just in India, but even in other places where Indian regiments were placed, there would be a grand revolt, and that was how British rule would be ended. Sadly, just a couple of days before the revolt was to take place, British intelligence was told by a mole that this was about to happen, and overnight they changed all the guards at the armories and took precautions, and as a result, at the very last minute, the revolt basically collapsed, with the one exception of Singapore, where the message had not reached. So the Indian regiment in Singapore actually did go into revolt, and for about a week the regiment in Singapore held the island until it was put down very brutally. As a result of this failure, Rash Behari Bose was forced to escape to Japan, but those who remained back in India continued to act, and Sachindranath Sanyal now began to make contacts with various groups, particularly the Germans who were fighting the British, of course, in the First World War, to try and get help. And the Germans were very keen on this, and they began to provide support at multiple levels, including to the Ghadarites in North America. And this, of course, meant that the British began to infiltrate this movement in North America as well, and began to, in fact, encourage the building and infiltration of anti-India gurudwaras to essentially capture this movement. And interestingly, this is the root of the Khalistani movement in Canada that you still have, is actually got to do with 100 years earlier, the British attempt to infiltrate the Indian nationalist movements and lead them in a particular direction. So this movement continued. Meanwhile, Sachindranath Sanyal was also captured and also sent off to Kalapani. But the Germans, meanwhile, had contacted another gentleman called Bagha Jatin in Bengal, and they promised him to bring large amounts of arms and armaments by ship and land them on the Odisha coast. They also promised them a raid on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to free up all the revolutionaries who were based there. And all of this was to happen on Christmas Day 1915. Again, however, due to the fact that a few of the key German agents switched sides. This attempt completely failed. Bagha Jatin, who was waiting on near Baleshwar for these armaments to arrive from the Germans, was tracked down and captured, and not captured, but he was killed, and so on. So this particular attempt also failed. Other attempts by the revolutionaries also didn't come to very much, including an expedition led by Barkatullah Khan and Raja Mahendra Singh to try and encourage the Afghans to revolt and invade Britain during the First World War. Now, although this whole episode had failed in carrying out a 1857 type insurrection, these ideas of the Ghadarites, however, remained alive. And when the Indian soldiers began to return after the First World War in 1919, the British were very, very concerned that this would lead to a big revolt, because you now had all these well-trained, armed and organized groups returning and increasingly radicalized by these ideas. This is the context in which they introduced the Rowlatt Acts, and the draconian Rowlatt Acts ultimately led to the succession of events that led to the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. So, in some ways, the sequence of events that had been set in place by the revolutionaries culminated with the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre and all that happened afterwards.